Broadcasting from our live studio in San Diego, California. This is RUNTALK with Dr. Jason. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's show, we're going to talk about something that is pretty popular to talk about on social media. There's a lot of people who run marathons in the U.S. and around the world. So today's topic is all about the marathon and how to set up your marathon training program, especially in these days during the pandemic and races, people not knowing when races are going to take place. So feel free to ask questions during the show. We will try to get to as many of them as possible. But today's topic is going to be all about setting up your own marathon training plan, because there's a lot of people on social media talk about this. They want to know what to do. They join a lot of these marathon training groups, whether they're in person or online. And there's a lot of commotion about this. A lot of people are very confused about how to train for a marathon. So I'm going to calm everyone down, relax. It's not as overwhelming as you think it might be. Because actually, on paper, the marathon is an easier race to train for than it is to train for shorter races, like 800 meters or a mile. The half mile or the mile are much more complicated races to train for because they are almost as much anaerobic as they are aerobic. The marathon is all aerobic. The anaerobic contribution to a marathon is negligible. And so that makes the training for a marathon much easier to comprehend and to plan out than it is to train for much shorter races. People think that the marathon is so long that that's what makes it so complicated. But the truth is that actually, even on paper, it's a much easier race to train for. So how do you train for a marathon and how do you do it correctly? Well, there's a number of ways that you can attack the problem. One way that I like to look at it is, well, what are the physiological factors that influence marathon performance? What makes somebody be able to run the marathon better than they had before? What are the underlying physiological factors influencing performance? Well, there are three major ones. You have Vo2 Max, the maximum volume of oxygen that the muscles can consume per minute. That represents the size of a person's aerobic engine. We talked about that a couple weeks ago on the first episode of RUNTALK. Then you have the lactate threshold, which I could make a whole nother episode, which I probably will in a few weeks' time. And there's a few ways you can think of the lactate threshold, but the easiest way to think of it is it's the fastest sustainable aerobic speed. So it's the fastest speed that you can sustain that is still purely aerobic. And that's really what the marathon is all about. It's running at as fast of an aerobic speed as you can for a long duration. And then the third physiological factor that influences marathon performance, and perhaps the most important one, is running economy. And that is the volume of oxygen consumed, the amount of oxygen that you need to run at a given submaximal pace. So if you think of the Vo2 max as the maximum volume of oxygen that the muscles can consume per minute, the running economy is how much oxygen can be consumed, the volume of oxygen consumed at any given submaximal speed. So you could think of it like gasoline in your car. The less gas you use to drive at a given speed, the more economical your car. It's the same thing with running economy. The less oxygen you use to run at a given speed, the more economical. So those are the three physiological factors that influence marathon performance. And that's what gives you the guide to how to train for those factors. Now that you know what's the underlying physiology, well, those are the three things I need to target in my training to improve my marathon performance. The other way you can look at it is, well, what are the things that cause fatigue in the marathon? What are the major things that cause you to slow down in a marathon? And then you train those things to slow down at a faster pace so that you can improve your performance. So there are a few major things that cause fatigue in the marathon. A major one is muscle fiber damage. Because of the constant hitting of the pavement, every time your leg lands on the ground, you're putting 2 to 3 times your body weight on each leg. And so there's a lot of muscle fiber damage in a marathon, especially if there's downhills in that marathon. Because when you run downhill, even though it may seem easier when you're running, there's actually more muscle fiber damage running downhill than there is running uphill because of all the eccentric or lengthening contractions when you run downhill. That's what makes something like the Boston Marathon course harder than what it might seem like on paper, because there's a considerable amount of downhill followed by the uphill late in the race. And so because there's a lot of muscle damage going downhill, then you can't produce as much force later in the race to go uphill. And so that's what makes a course like that so challenging. And so that's one major thing that causes fatigue in the marathon. The other thing is running out of glycogen. Glycogen is the muscle's preferred fuel. It's the stored form of carbohydrate, and we have glucose in our blood, and we take a bunch of glucose molecules and string them together and branch them out like a tree branch, and you get glycogen. And that's stored in your muscles and your liver. What makes the marathon unique from other races is that it is the only race in which you're going to run out of fuel, because we have enough stored glycogen to last a little bit more than 2 hours of moderate intensity sustained exercise. And so even the half marathon for most people isn't long enough to completely run out of glycogen. That doesn't happen until you get to the marathon. So we got muscle fiber damage that causes fatigue in a marathon, makes you slow down. We have glycogen depletion, the lowering of the glycogen fuel tank, because when you run out of your preferred fuel source, well, what's left to use? Fat. And when we use fat, we break down fat in a much slower process than to break down carbohydrate. And so the end result is that we get energy from muscle contraction. It takes much longer to get energy from muscle contraction by breaking down fat than to break down carbohydrate. And so that's why the pace slows down. You want to be relying on carbohydrate for the entire length of the marathon. Once you run out of carbohydrate, once your fuel tank gets low, then you're forced to rely on fat, and by necessity, the pace is going to slow down. So muscle fiber damage, glycogen depletion, dehydration is another big factor that causes fatigue in a marathon, because when you lose body water, there are consequences. Water is very important for a lot of chemical reactions involved in metabolism, most notably the breaking apart of ATP, or energy currency, inside muscle to cause muscle contraction. In fact, it's called ATP hydrolysis, the breaking down of ATP into its constituents to liberate energy from muscle contraction. That's called ATP hydrolysis because it requires water in that chemical reaction. Decreasing body water also decreases blood volume. You know, a lot of your blood is actually water. The plasma volume of the blood is made up of mostly water. And so when you lose body water through all that sweating over the hours that it's taking to run a marathon, then that decreases blood volume. And if we decrease blood volume, we decrease stroke volume out of the heart, the amount of blood the heart pumps per beat. That goes down. If we decrease stroke volume, we decrease cardiac output, the volume of blood leaving the heart per minute. And if we decrease cardiac output, that decreases the amount of blood flow going to the muscle. And why is that important? Because oxygen is carried inside of that blood. And so the less blood that you have going from the heart to the skeletal muscles, because you've decreased blood volume from dehydration, then the less available oxygen to the muscles. And so that's why dehydration causes fatigue. And so we have three major things. We can also add psychological fatigue. There's chemicals in your brain that influences your motivation and your positive energy, and that will decrease when you go on very, very long runs like a marathon. So we have some physiological factors that influence fatigue in the marathon. We have psychological factors and psychological fatigue, and all those things can be trained as you put those together with the physiological factors that influence marathon performance, the Vo2 Max, the lactate threshold, the running economy, and together that's your blueprint of how I can approach the training of a marathon. So let's put this all together and make this simple for people, because that's pretty complicated when you look at it. There's a lot of things to consider. But if we put this all together, is how to design your marathon training program. It all starts with mileage. The first goal is to get the volume up, because more than anything else that's going to influence your performance, it's the amount of weekly running volume and monthly running volume and yearly running volume That's what influences marathon performance more than anything else. And so you have to slowly and systematically increase how much running you do. So say you're starting with 3 days a week of running if you're a beginner. If you're more advanced, you may jump right into 5 or 6 or even 7 days of running per week. But if you start with 3 days of running per week, once those days start to encroach upon an hour each day on average, then start adding more days per week. So then you would go, instead of making the runs longer than an hour and sticking with 3 days a week, a better strategy is to add another day. So add a 4th day, and then spread the stress. Don't just jump in and add a 4th day of an extra hour. Start with something less. So the way you organize your training, not every day is the same amount. Some days you go a little bit more, some days you go a little bit less, some days you go a little bit more, some days you go a little bit less. One day makes significantly longer than the other days, but not so much longer, because that's a big mistake that a lot of people make when they train for a marathon. That maybe they run, 30 miles a week, but 15 of those miles is 1 day per week. Don't do that. That's a big mistake. That's a recipe for injury. You have to spread the stress around over the week and make one run significantly longer than the other. So maybe one day you go a little bit more, and one day you go a little bit less, and another day you go a little bit more, and another day you go a little bit less, and then your long run you go a little bit more than the other more days. And so you have this undulating process. You have this very elegant undulating process where you go some days a little bit more and provide a little bit of stress, and other days provide a little bit less stress to recover from the stress of the day before. And then another day you go a little bit higher, and another day you go a little bit lower. And so you spread the stress around over the week and undulate that every single week and every single month so that the monthly volume mirrors the weekly volume. And everything moves in concert with everything else. So you don't just keep extending the length of the long run without increasing the amount of running you do during the week. The long run ideally shouldn't make up more than about a third of the weekly mileage. So if your long run is 15 miles, you should be running about 45 miles a week. And that's a safe way. Now, to get there, though, you have to do it very slowly, very systematically, and don't keep increasing things week after week. Spend time running 15 miles a week until you habituate to that. And then when you habituate to that, then increase from 15 miles a week and add 1 mile per day per week. So say you're averaging, say you run, maybe one day you run 5, and another day you run 3, and another day you run 7, and another day you run 4. Add 1 mile to each of those days, and that's how you increase the stress over time. So if you're running 5 days a week, then add 1 mile, when it's time to increase, add 1 mile to each of those 5 days, and then you've run 5 extra miles for the week. And that's a safe way to do it. Do the same thing with a long run. Add about 1 mile at a time, or you can think in terms of minutes. It's always better to think in terms of time rather than miles, because what represents the stress is time, not miles. So it's always better to do that. So, add more time rather than to think in terms of miles. Add maybe 5 to 10 minutes per run rather than add it all, in terms of miles. So that's a better way to do the training. Just add, everything increases in concert. The long run with the weekly volume, and the weekly volume shouldn't make more than it shouldn't be, the long run shouldn't be more than about a third of the weekly volume. I'm trying to look at what people are talking, so it's making me lose my train of thought here. But people are in the room. Okay. So that's the first step, is to focus on the increase in volume. You don't have to worry about running faster workouts just yet. Just focus on the increase in the volume. That's always the first step. Then when you have a significant amount of volume behind you, what's significant? Well, it depends. I mean, if you're running a marathon and you want to run it well, you should get the volume up as high as you can. Get it up to at least 50 miles a week. If you're running less than 50 miles a week to train for a marathon, the marathon is going to be a long day at the office. It's going to be very difficult for you to get through it and feel like you are in control of the race rather than the race controlling you. Okay, so you want to be running at least 50 miles a week to train for a marathon. Now, if you're starting at 10 or 15, that's fine. You just have to give yourself plenty of time to get up to that volume. Don't just try to do it in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or even in 2 months. You have to increase the stress slowly and systematically to get up to a significant amount of volume. And so spend a few weeks at each level of stress before you increase the stress. Maybe run 20 miles or 25 miles for 3 or 4 weeks before you increase it above that. And then run 25 miles for 3 or 4 weeks before you increase it to 30. And then run 30 miles for 3 or 4 weeks before you increase it to 35. And then run 35 miles for a few weeks before you increase it to 40. That's a safe way to do it, rather than a lot of these marathon training programs that you see plastered all over the internet and all over social media, and they increase the length of the long run and they increase the volume of the week much too quickly, and half the people get injured. And it's a shame, because there's no reason why you need to get injured training for a marathon. It really should be about the training process, not about the day of the race. The day of the race is just a celebration of all the hard work that you put into it. And so it's, we hear all the time, it's the journey, it's not the destination. Well, you got to enjoy the process. And the way you enjoy the process is to really immerse yourself into the training, and do it in a smart way. So once you have accumulated a significant volume, or as you're increasing the volume, then you can start to insert more quality aerobic workouts to train the lactate threshold. So getting back to what are the physiological factors that influence marathon performance, the reason for doing the volume is to attend to all of the metabolic factors that influence performance and to improve the running economy. Perhaps the most significant attribute gained from high mileage is the increase in running economy. Runners who run the most tend to be the most economical. Now, it's possible that they are just genetically talented and most economical, and that's why they can handle running a lot. But doing a lot of running also improves the running economy. We can improve running economy, the volume of oxygen you consume to maintain a given pace, by running more volume. So that's perhaps one of the most significant attributes that you gain from running higher mileage. The other attribute is that you will increase your Vo2 max through the peripheral or the muscular adaptations. There are 2 parts to the Vo2 max. The metabolic machinery, the mitochondria, where aerobic metabolism takes place, and the cardiac output, how much blood is being ejected out of the heart per minute. So we'll get to the cardiac output side later when we talk about the interval training. But to increase the weekly volume, that attends to the muscular side. And so you can increase your Vo2 max, at least initially, through increasing the weekly running volume, and you can increase your running economy through increasing the weekly running volume. And so as you're building this aerobic base with more and more miles per day and per week and per month and per year, then you can start to increase the amount of more quality aerobic training that you do with lactate threshold training. So this gets us into what a lot of runners call tempo run. But it's called a tempo run because you run it at an up tempo, at a higher tempo than your easier running, your easy running days. And so how to do those workouts correctly, I noticed that these kinds of workouts are among the most difficult to do, because these are the most difficult workouts to do because it's hard to hold back. A lot of runners just want to push, 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 push. But to train your lactate threshold, you have to run at a comfortably hard pace, a pace that is high-end aerobic. You don't want to cross over into a speed that becomes more anaerobic. Once you run faster than your lactate threshold, you start to introduce a significant anaerobic contribution. Still more aerobic than not, but you start to introduce a significant anaerobic contribution, and fatigue becomes imminent, and you start training other things that you don't want to train. And so you want to focus on quality aerobic training, high-end aerobic training with these threshold workouts. So you can do it either as an interval workout where you do maybe periods of 5 to 10 minutes at your threshold pace, and then you recover for a short period of time, and then you repeat those bouts of running at a high-end aerobic, comfortably hard pace. Or you can do it as a continuous tempo run. Go for 20, 25 minutes and run at your threshold pace for the entire time. So another talk we can get deeper into, another show we can get deeper into lactate threshold and how to determine what your threshold pace is, but for the purpose of today's episode, threshold is comfortably hard. It feels like a 7 to 7.5, maybe touching on an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. And it is significantly slower than your 5K race pace. For a recreational runner, it may be pretty close to 10K race pace. For a good runner, it's going to be a little bit slower, maybe 10 to 15 seconds per mile slower than 10K race pace for a very good runner. So it's comfortably hard, high-end aerobic, and you can last at that pace for a while. A very well-trained runner can run at that pace for almost an hour at that pace. Whereas more recreational runners, maybe they can do it for 40 minutes, 45 minutes. There's a lot of variability in how long someone can hold their threshold pace. So it's hard to give an exact recommendation because a recreational runner who's not very well trained yet won't be able to hold threshold pace for that long, maybe a half an hour. Whereas someone who's very well trained can hold that pace for even up to an hour in a race type of a situation. So there's a lot of variability in how long threshold pace can be sustained, but that's something that can be trained. In fact, it can be trained a lot, and that's part of training for a marathon. You want to have a very big aerobic engine, you want to have a high Vo2 max, and you want to train your lactate threshold because the threshold represents the fraction of that Vo2 max that can be sustained. So here's your Vo2 max. Most people their threshold may be down here. If you take a cross section of the population, the threshold is maybe down here. But with training, you can move that threshold. Even if the Vo2 max doesn't change, you can move that threshold up to a higher fraction or percentage of the Vo2 max, so you can sustain a higher percentage of that Vo2 max. And that's extremely important for something like a marathon. You want to be able to sustain as high a fraction of the size of that aerobic engine for as long as you possibly can. And so that's why you start to integrate these threshold workouts as you're building the aerobic base. And so when you first start doing it, how do you set up the marathon training plan? Well, first, do one workout a week. Just start with one workout a week, and then get used to that. And then over time, you can add a second workout per week of the threshold. A lot of good runners, when they're really heavy into training and they're doing a lot of training, you might even squeeze in a third threshold workout per week. But that's pretty rare. That would only happen under certain circumstances at certain parts of the marathon training plan. Usually 2 is enough. You don't really need more than 2 for most of the time. But I'd start with 1. And then you do that for a while. As you're building the aerobic base, you insert the threshold workout. You can also throw some fartleks in there because it serves the same purpose. Go out, run a 5-mile fartlek or something like that, and pick up the pace and bring the pace down, and pick it up and bring it down. But don't pick it up to anything faster than threshold, because the point is to train the aerobic metabolism at its high end. And so you want to raise the threshold by running right at the upper limit of that threshold. So there's many ways you can do that. You can do it as a fartlek and get out in nature. You can do it as a tempo run. You can do it as an interval workout on the track. There's multiple ways you can do that. But the point is to run at threshold pace. And so once you've done that, once you've gotten the mileage up and you've inserted a lot of the threshold workouts, then what you can do is take out, like say you're doing 2 threshold workouts a week, then take out one of those threshold workouts and insert a Vo2 Max workout. So now we get into the other side of Vo2 Max, how to improve it through the cardiac output side. So if you do an interval workout where you're running at the maximum capability for your heart to do its job, then that is a very strong stimulus to make the heart stronger and make it a better pump so that you can increase your stroke volume and increase your maximum cardiac output. And so you do an interval workout where you may go 3-minute reps, maybe 3.5 to 4-minute reps once you're very well trained, but start with 3-minute reps at your maximum heart rate. So it's not as fast as you can go, it's the slowest speed at which you're going to reach your maximum heart rate. Because when you reach your maximum heart rate, you also reach your Vo2 max, and that's the goal of the training, to reach your Vo2 max during the workout and repeat that as many times as you can during the workout. So you would run 3-minute reps at maximum heart rate and then recover and jog for 2 to 3 minutes. So you want the work to rest ratio to be 1 to 1 or 1 to slightly less than 1. So if you run for 3 minutes, take a 2 to 3 minute jog. then run hard again for 3 minutes, raise the heart rate up to as close to its maximum as you can get it, and then recover for a 2 to 3 minute jog, and then raise it back up, and then recover for a 2 to 3 minute jog, and keep going back and forth and doing that for as many times as it takes until you're exhausted. And then make sure the next day is a very easy day, or if you're not running every day of the week, you can even take that as a complete rest day, because it is a hard workout, and you have to balance the stress with the recovery. Most people, when they do their marathon training, since today's show is all about marathon training, one thing that people do is that they take their easy runs too fast, and they don't take their hard runs hard enough. And it's much better to polarize the training. Hard is hard to force physiological adaptations to be made, and easy is very, very easy to recover from those hard efforts. And so you have to make sure that you balance the hard work with the recovery. I see people on Instagram, I'm going to call them out. I won't call them out by name, but I'm going to call out the concept. I see people on Instagram all the time, they post their workout, how they have those apps, I don't know where they get it. They post, I guess it comes off the iPhone, I don't have an iPhone. They post an app with a picture of themselves, and in the corner it says their run and their pace. And I always look at that and I think, boy, if you're running that pace for that, what's supposed to be an easy run, your marathon PR should be a heck of a lot faster. Your half marathon PR should be a heck of a lot faster. People run way too hard on their easy days and not hard enough on their hard days. And in order to be able to run hard enough on the hard days, the easy days have to be excruciatingly easy. I can't emphasize that enough. There are at least 3 reasons to make the easy days easy. One, maybe one of the most important ones, is that by running the easy days easy, it enables you to increase the total volume over time. And like I said earlier, the most important part of the training is the weekly running volume. If you go into a marathon with months of running 60 plus miles per week, you're going to run that marathon a lot better than if you go into that marathon on only 30 miles per week. And so how do you go from 30 to 60? You have to run those easy days very, very easy and give your body a chance to adapt. Because 60 miles a week, that's already a lot. And if you're running 6 days a week, an average of 10 miles a day, that's a lot of running. And most people are not going to do that. You don't necessarily have to do that to run a marathon, but the more running you do compared to what you're doing now is going to greatly influence your running performance. And even if your goal is just to finish the marathon rather than run a PR, still, don't you want to be in control of the race and have a good experience at the marathon rather than the marathon controlling you? Most people are dragging themselves to the finish line rather than them being able to pick up the pace over the last few miles. If you watch the best runners in the world, they're running their fastest at the end of the marathon. Well, how do they do that? Because they are so well trained, the marathon is no longer a stretch for them. They've run so many long runs in training, they have run so much weekly volume that they can easily handle the 26.2 mile distance, and they can actually pick up the pace toward the end, whereas most people can't do that. And a lot of that comes back to the training. And so one reason to slow down the long runs is to be able to increase the weekly volume over time. Number 2 is to prevent injury, because you only want to run as fast as you need to meet the purpose of the workout. If you're constantly running faster than what you need to meet the purpose of that day's run, you're just adding stress with no extra benefit. And all that stress over time accumulates, and then you get a stress fracture, or then you get Achilles tendonitis, or some other itis that runners are prone to get. And so you got to slow down the run so that you minimize the stress. And then the 3rd reason is so that your legs are not fatigued when it's time tomorrow to do a hard interval workout. And so those are 3 major reasons to slow down the easy runs. 1, so that you can add to the volume over time. 2, to decrease the risk of injury. And 3, so that your legs are really ready to get as much out of the hard workout when it's time to run hard. That you're not coming into that workout on dead legs because yesterday you ran too fast. Okay, so that's one way to set up the training of a marathon. Number 1, start with the volume. and systematically and slowly increase the amount of running that you do from week to week and month to month and year to year. And then once you have been increasing that volume, then start inserting the lactate threshold workouts that you can do a number of different ways. And then once you've done a lot of that, then start slowly and systematically. I use those words all the time. Slow and systematic increase in the stress. Start increasing the stress by adding the Vo2 Max interval workouts. And start with 1 a week. Then if you can and you have time in your program, you can add a second 1 a week. And as you notice me saying this, I hope, to the astute observer here, you'll notice that as I'm talking about all these phases of training, in order to plan this out, even though I'm talking about this in the forward direction, about what to do first, then what to do second, then what to do third, the astute observer will notice that you have to plan the training backwards. You have to look at what's the date of the race, and then plan backwards from the date of that race so that you don't run out of time with all this training. You have to know, how many weeks am I going to devote to this phase of training, the aerobic phase, and building the volume? How much time am I going to devote to the threshold training? Then how much time am I going to devote to the Vo2 Max training? And as you move along, you plan it backwards, and as you move through this, you have to make sure that you give yourself enough time in each phase to get done all the work that you need to get done. And as the workouts get more intense, the volume starts to either slightly decrease to handle the greater intensity, or maintain the volume where it was. Don't try to increase the volume and intensity at the same time. So unless you're very talented, I wouldn't suggest trying to increase the weekly volume at the same time you put in the harder interval workouts. And so you have to plan this out to see, well, if I want to get to 50 miles a week, or if I want to get to 80 miles a week, how long is that going to take? And plan out the training backwards from the date of the race. Now, right now, we don't know exactly when a lot of races are going to take place. This gives people a great chance to really develop themselves aerobically, because it takes time to develop yourself aerobically. It's not something that happens overnight, because a lot of these adaptations, it's all protein synthesis. How do you make more mitochondria? Well, it's all protein synthesis. How do you make more red blood cells to carry oxygen? It's all protein synthesis. All this stuff takes time. And so the aerobic phase of training should be your longest phase of training. Once you start putting in the more quality work, it doesn't take as long to get fit. You see improvements more quickly, especially when you do the anaerobic work, which you don't really need to do much for a marathon. So plan it out so that you have plenty of time. Plan it out so that you have plenty of time. So that's why you got to plan it out backwards. And like I said earlier, even though the marathon is all aerobic, if you have time, and if you're really looking for a PR in the marathon, like if you're looking to run fast, if you're a female and you want to run under 2:30, if you're a male, you want to run 2:15, you still need to do some anaerobic work, because you need an anaerobic reserve. If you just train aerobically all the time and you don't have any anaerobic reserve, you're not going to have the speed to run a very fast marathon. If you look at the very best marathoners, they're also very fast at a mile. The best male marathoners can run well under a sub 4-minute mile. The best female marathoners can run well under a 4:30 mile. And so they're also very fast. You have to be fast to be able to run a fast marathon. But even if you're looking to run a 3-hour marathon or a 3:30 or a 4-hour marathon, it still helps to have a little bit of anaerobic reserve. And so you might want to do a little bit of anaerobic training. Not much, but it helps. Ideally, you should be training with a whole continuum of speeds, even for a marathon, from very, very slow to very, very fast. However, for a marathon, the very, very fast takes up just a minor percentage of the training, whereas if you train for a shorter race, it takes up a much larger percentage of the training. So we'll talk about anaerobic training on another show, because we could spend a whole other show on that. But suffice it to say for now that you should devote at least a little bit of time to the real short fast, the true speed work, where you may run for 60 seconds very fast and then recover for 2 minutes, and then run 60 seconds fast and recover for 2 minutes. You may want to do a workout like that maybe once every 2 weeks as you get later into your marathon training program. But the first strategy is always to increase the weekly volume because of how it attends to the underlying physiology. A lot of people know you got to run a lot to be good at the marathon, but what they not necessarily know is, well, why? You always need to know why, because that why dictates how you train. And so let's get back to now the causes of fatigue in the marathon. The muscle fiber damage is the first thing I mentioned. Well, that's where your long runs come in. You want to do a number of long runs on the road, not do them on the trail. If you're preparing for a road marathon, if you're preparing for a trail marathon, then of course do them on the trail. But if you're preparing for a marathon on the road, then do all your long runs on the road, do all your long tempo runs on the road. Incorporate hills, especially if the marathon is going to have hills. Incorporate downhills, because that has a lot of eccentric contractions and that causes a lot of muscle fiber damage. So even if you're training for a flat road marathon, it's still helpful to do some long runs on long tempo runs with some downhill so that you cause some muscle damage, because when you cause muscle damage in training, the muscle fibers are going to get stronger and more resilient and more enduring, and that's going to help you even for a flat marathon. So eccentric training can be very vital. It can be very beneficial to a marathoner to get used to the muscle fiber damage. And so you got to do that as much as possible. Do as many long runs and as many long tempo runs as possible to get the legs used to the muscle fiber damage. The dehydration is another thing that causes fatigue in the marathon. And so how do you handle that in training? Well, you train under those conditions. Sometimes you do long runs and you don't take anything to drink. Training, you can think of training as all about imposing some kind of a threat on some aspect of your body's survival, and your body will make adaptations to assuage those threats. And so one of the strategies that you can employ on some long runs is to go without taking in any water. Dehydrate yourself on long runs and then hydrate after the run. Don't do this every time. Sometimes in the long run you want to hydrate and you want to take exactly what you're going to take in the marathon. But on some long run, go on a 3-hour run and don't take anything to drink. And you put yourself in that condition of being dehydrated. And your body will try to compensate for that by doing what? Holding on to water. Because if the body thinks that it's under duress, it's going to try to hold on to what it needs to hold on to assuage the threat. And so you can train yourself in a dehydrated state to prepare for a marathon. And it's the same thing with glycogen depletion. Is another thing that causes fatigue in the marathon. How do you train that? You train that by doing long runs, doing long tempo runs without taking in any carbohydrate, so that you force your body to handle that threat. One of the things that our body does, it's very elegant when we threaten or deplete its supply of fuel, is that we make more fuel. And so when you go on a long run and you run out of the muscle's preferred fuel, carbohydrate, then during recovery, your muscles will assuage that threat by building a bigger fuel tank so that you synthesize and store more glycogen for the future, so that you improve your endurance to the future. And so on some long runs, don't take any carbohydrate. Some you have to, because you want to practice the same strategy that you will in the marathon, so that you don't get an upset stomach when you take carbohydrate in the marathon. So you have to alternate. Sometimes you take carbohydrate in a workout, and sometimes you don't. You plan for the things that cause fatigue in the marathon, and you train those things so that by the time you get to the marathon, you have trained all of the physiological factors that influence performance, and you have targeted the specific things that cause fatigue in the marathon, so that hopefully you'll overcome that and you won't be fatigued as much. I mean, no matter what you do in training, you're always going to fatigue in the marathon, because that's the point. You're pushing your body as hard as it can. But the goal is to be able to run at a faster pace before those things start to become a problem, before you get dehydrated, before you run out of glycogen. And so that's why you focus on those things in training. So that gives you a framework of how to design the training plan. First, systematically and slowly increase the volume of work that you do. If you're not running 6 or 7 days a week already, then start by running however many days you run, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4, and then the first strategy, add another day of training. And then get used to that, then add another day. And then when you're up to 5 or 6 days of training, Then start to increase how much you do per day by adding 1 mile per day per week. Then after you've done that for a while, start inserting the more quality aerobic workouts, the fartleks, the tempo runs, the lactate threshold interval workouts to train your threshold. Then once you have done that for a while, once you've done that, then start getting into the interval training to focus on the cardiac output and the cardiac side of Vo2 Max. And so that way, when you do all that, you attend to all 3 physiological factors, Vo2 Max, lactate threshold, running economy, and you attend to the causes of fatigue in the marathon, muscle fiber damage, glycogen depletion, dehydration, and then another benefit of the long runs, we didn't mention it yet, but also the psychological part of the long runs, just psychologically getting used to going for long periods of time. Okay, let's get to some questions here. Hi, Irene. Christopher Sardo asked, with no marathon in sight and already been doing 80 to 90 kilometers per week all year, should I include speed work now or wait until we're about 3 or 4 months out from the race? Good question. Wait. There's 2 things I'll say about this. Number 1, speed work really refers to the anaerobic work. Doing mile reps at threshold pace or doing Vo2 Max interval workout, that's not real speed work because you're not working on speed. And this gets back to what I've said before, is that always understand the purpose of the workout. When you train your threshold with the tempo runs, or if you do it as an interval format, you're training your lactate threshold. You're training for your ability to run at a faster aerobic pace, a faster pace and have it still be aerobic. So that has nothing to do with speed. That has to do with aerobic metabolism. It has to do with endurance. Even when you do the Vo2 Max workouts, the goal of a Vo2 Max workout is to enhance the heart's ability to pump blood and oxygen to the working muscles. It's a cardiovascular purpose, to be able to send more oxygen to the working muscles. So again, it's about endurance. It's aerobic. Speed work isn't until you get to the anaerobic side, which is minimal when you're training for a marathon. Like I said earlier, you could do a little bit of it, especially if you want to run, if you're at that level where you're running pretty fast, then you have to attend a little bit to the anaerobic side so you have an anaerobic reserve. But to answer your question, you want to wait, because once you start doing the faster workouts, then you start to initiate getting to a peak. You can hold off on getting to that peak by extending the amount of aerobic work that you do. And so because you don't know when the marathon is going to happen yet, because the race dates aren't set yet, and sometimes we still don't know what's going to happen come the fall, spend more time developing yourself aerobically. The good thing about the aerobic side of this is that it's virtually unlimited. You can always do more easy running. The best runners in the world run up more than 100 miles per week. I'm not saying that everyone has to do that. Of course, most people, if they did that, they get injured. So you don't want to do that. You have to find where your sweet spot is. But the more time you spend developing yourself aerobically, the better you're going to be on race day. And so this delay right now, that because we don't know when marathons are going to take place, that actually works in runners' favor. Because most runners don't spend enough time developing themselves aerobically. They jump right into the interval workouts. And so now is a great chance for you to really spend time developing yourself aerobically. So to directly answer your question, Christopher, wait on doing the more quality workouts later. Wait on doing the faster interval workouts later and spend time developing yourself aerobically. You can do something like strides at the end of a 2 or 3 runs per week just to inject a little bit of speed without the anaerobic metabolism, which causes fatigue. So that at least trains some fast twitch fibers without causing any fatigue. So you can maintain a little bit of pop in your legs by including 20-second strides that you do pretty quick. But other than that, I wouldn't do the more anaerobic metabolic type of speed work, because that's going to cause you to reach your peak sooner. And you want to hold off on that because you don't know when the race is going to be yet. And then once you know when the race is going to be, then you can work backwards from that race and plan out how much time you need for each of the phases to finish off your marathon training program. Nicole is on here. Hi, Nicole. So if you're just joining us, this is Run Talk with Dr. Jason. I'm Dr. Jason Karp, your host. Each Monday, we will broadcast live into your living room or your kitchen or wherever you plan on watching this, both on Facebook and Instagram Live at Dr. Jason Karp. And we're coming to the end of the show right now. And so with each show, I like to finish with a final thought. And so first let me see if there are any other questions about marathon training before we get into the final thoughts. And this will always be saved on Instagram, on IGTV, so you can view it later. A lot of people saying hi, Michael, all the way from Switzerland. He's joining us. We have people from all over the world joining us. This is great. And again, this will be saved on so if you don't catch the live version, this will be saved on Instagram live at Dr. Jason Karp. Join us every Monday for Run Talk with Dr. Jason. And I'd like to finish the show with a final thought. Running eliminates the stress of most of life's problems, heightening the enjoyment of the good things in life, at least for the precious moments that we run. We can literally put space between ourselves and our problems, inserting clarity in the space, and developing the confidence to handle and deal with what is asked of us. The confidence and empowerment that running gives us can make every hour of our lives better. See you next time on Run Talk with Dr. Jason. Bye for now.